we've looked at fairy tales as one example of story or narrative and the force of those within culture. We're also, in this unit, we're going to look at myth and how myth works underneath a culture or within a contemporary writer's work. When I think about myth here, I don't want you to think about myth as a story that's not true, but I want you to think about myth as a story that has force, particularly as it's a narrative response to the irrational aspects of human experience. Classical myths here engaged kind of basic human experiences, such as, for example, death, right? That ancient myths, engaged the human experience of death, grief, and loss by, thinking it through as a story in some way. That it was the story of a journey to an other or underworld, and this, gave a response to the human experience of grief or loss. In the end, similarly, classic myths engaged sexuality's force within human experience. Why is it that you fall in love with the person you fall in love with? It's not for particularly rational reasons usually, right? That desire has this kind of irrational force on us, and so you have figures like Cupid, right, who hits you with an arrow, and then you fall in love with the first person you see, right, and all the gods laugh and joke. The desire has that kind of force. Sexual desire has that kind of force and effect on human experience. So myths engage that irrational experience. We continue to think through myth in American culture today as well, in a lot of ways, right? And myths kind of find play between those spaces where history and memory define us as a nation or people. That sometimes there's a myth emerges that is able to kind of bridge that distance between history and memory in some ways. For example, we have myths about geography and place in the Americas. So if you think about all the legendary figures of the American West, and how the mythic stories defined that West versus, in what ways does it change? Do the myths change if you think about that very same geographical space as the Mexican North and the boundaries that are there and how those boundaries are so kind of mythical in the end? We also think through myth in thinking about concepts of identity, particularly around ethnicity or race. So you can think about all the mythic kinds of aspects of the ways in which we define whiteness or blackness within the culture and how those things have been used to reinforce a clear sense of definition there. If you need another example of this, you can think about the mythic basis of the last two presidencies, and how geography and myth defined those presidencies. Where was George W. Bush from? Where are his origins? And most people would answer Texas, right? But he really wasn't from Texas. He was from New England. I mean, he grew up in Connecticut and Maine. He went to Yale. Only later in adult life did he move to Texas and became, the figure in the cowboy hat and flannel shirt, cutting brush near Crawford, Texas, on his ranch, right? And so, there's a kind of a mythic force to who George W. Bush was as a politician. Similarly, Barack Obama, where was he from? He was born in Hawaii, grew up in various places in the world, went to Harvard, but it's through Chicago, right, that he kind of has a sense of place, right, that he becomes Barack Obama as the senator from Illinois, as someone who worked on Chicago's South Side, right, not only Chicago, but Chicago's South Side, that kind of toughness there that defined him as a political figure. So the mythic is really powerful in the ways in which we engage culture and figures, and our writers today, Susan Power and Barry Hanna, recognize that in the stories that they tell, and so how mythic or sacred story becomes a part of how we understand the world and our place in it. Susan Power's story Moonwalker is basically around the story of a woman, Margaret Manywounds, who is dying. So you have a moment of mythic passage here, right? That she is on a journey, and she's kind of telling the story of her life through the course of this. As she tells that story, she distinguishes her life from the two other worlds in particular. First, the world of the Catholic Church, right? The priest who comes to attend her death but doesn't make it quite in time, and also the world of the reservation agent, right? The American governance of the res, right? That instead, Margaret seeks to return to the tribal world, right? That this is one of the worlds that really marks her for who she is, the world of tribal, sacred story, and tribal journey. She is also marked by the story of her love affair with Dr. Seiichi Sakuma, a Japanese physician who comes to the area to take care of Japanese POWs during the war, and so she's marked by that world as well. Even as her daughter says, she's trying to find a way out of her skin through her stories. So she re-enters this world of tribal myths or sacred stories here, recovering an old faith from her youth when there was magic. So she reclaims that sense of tribal magic and power here, right? It's been a part of her life all along that with her first husband, Charles Bad Holy MacLeod, she reclaims him for the tribe through that magic and through her songs that she's learned through the tribe before he dies. And then she also recalls her grandmother's dress and, charges her grandson to go find it and return it to the res, eventually. It's in the Field Museum in Chicago, she says. And so she even takes her grandson on a kind of mythic journey to the moon's surface, as she's dying. And so this world of story and myth is the world that she returns to. Against that, we have Evie's return to the reservation to care for her mother, Margaret. She comes from the Twin Cities and is a part of the modern world, that she sees reservation life as one that's out of balance and prefers the safety of a world that she could see with her own eyes. So Evie returns, and she feels this sense of displacement here, right? That she envies her sister Lydia's beauty. She envies a sense of the way that Lydia is seen as part of the tribe, that she has the voice of a ghost, that she's able to kind of call back that magic in ways that Evie cannot. She listens to her mother. She believes still that her father was a blood Indian from Calgary and only comes kind of face to face with some displacement here as well, right? As who was her father in the end. And then on her mother's death, she feels naked and afraid, that she feels severed from the tribal life, and perhaps feels a sense of need for a return to those sacred stories to ground her or place her in the end. The whole story turns around the date of July 17, 1969, the Apollo 11 mission to the moon. That Harley is watching television. He sees his grandmother's figure emerge on the screen and sees her dance through Neil Armstrong, as he says. So the effect of the whole story is to kind of cause you as reader to rethink the boundaries between the sacred and ordinary worlds here. And Power does a really nice job of exploring those boundaries and the experience of them in Moonwalker. Barry Hannah in Testimony of Pilot also kind of engages some basic American mythologies through his narrator William, a man who is a Southerner, lives in Jackson, Mississippi at the time of the story's telling, but grows up in Clinton, Mississippi, a town between Jackson and the Vicksburg on the river there. William wants clear boundaries in life in all kinds of ways. That he sees a clear boundary with what he calls an end town within Clinton from the very beginning. That he sees the race line that's drawn in Clinton as a clear thing at that point. He kind of enjoys this savage boyhood that's like Tom Sawyer's growing up, right, where he and his friend Radcliffe have this homemade mortar that they fire flashlight batteries out of. And they love the explosions and the violence of the whole thing, and it's how they meet Quadberry in the end when they bounce a couple batteries off Quadberry's home's tin roof. He wants a clear sense of boundary as well in terms of a sense of gender here, right? That he wants to be seen as a man over and over again, and in that he chooses drums when he as an instrument that he plays versus Quadberry's desperate oralness on the saxophone. He reminds you that in high school he's coming on as a drummer and a lover, as he's developing as a man throughout the course of this whole thing. That's against the kind of romantic perspective that he has when he plays jazz, or when he, plays the drums, plays Ravel's Bolero, a classical piece. That's that feeling of that music brings to him as a person. But he wants to be seen as a man. He wants to, a sense of the kind of chivalrous existence that's there. When Quadberry asks him to take care of his girlfriend Lillian, William agrees to do that, even though he feels sexual desire for Lillian. He says he'll take care of her for Quadberry when Quadberry goes off to the Naval Academy and to war eventually. But he wrestles with those boundaries in the end. When Lillian dies in a hijacking, he doesn't deal well, particularly with the grief of it. It seems that he can only imagine her as a cloud over the Gulf of Mexico. But then he wants to try to force these boundaries on his identity as a man versus how men deal with women. And so he speaks of taming Esther, who is Lillian's little sister, to clean and cook around the place. So he wants these boundaries, but how does he define them within his experience, particularly in his experience of Quadberry's own heroic identity, right? As that heroic identity is kind of told in the context of the Vietnam War, a very divisive time in American culture and politics. So William is always trying to kind of measure himself as a man against Quadberry's heroic identity here. And so Quadberry goes off to war. He flies jets. He commits acts of violence. As he says to Lillian at one point, Quadberry says, "I am a dragon, America the beautiful, like you will never know." Right? Quadberry doesn't see himself as a man flying a jet. He sees himself as this mythic creature, mythic and violent, and beautiful. And so how does the narrator measure himself up to that kind of mythic force? He tries to, over and over again, as he remembers and writes about Quadberry, a man that he seems to love, right, through that writing. He experiences, he says, a fit of nostalgia such as I'm having right now as I write this. He wrestles with memory. He wrestles with, how he measures himself against Quadberry throughout the story. And he remembers this reunion at Jackson Airport where Quadberry asks him how Jackson is now, and William says it's horrible. It's full of aluminum subdivisions. It's going to hurt to drive back into. It hurts me every day, William says to Quadberry. And even to the very end of this story, right, he's wrestling with it, right? Quadberry seeks a surgery to fix the pain with his back, and in the midst of the surgery he dies. And as William writes, Quadberry died. That is why I told this story and will never tell another. That he wants kind of a clear boundary to it in the end. And the question is, does he find it through telling the story, or does the mythic force of Quadberry's life, leave him unresolved in the end? So it'd be interesting to hear how you think about the force of mythic stories and their impact still on the culture. I hope you enjoyed these two stories, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks.